they always say, well, there's no money for that. It's really hard to get government money. Yeah, all of that's true. It is very hard. And it's something that can be a significant barrier. But I want to say, don't give up hope here, because having worked in the nonprofit segment forever, for my entire career, I can tell you that if you are creative, there are things that you can do that will make the situation better for new moms. Okay, so again, you really do have to keep in mind always your scope of practice. What is kind of allowable limits of your profession, whatever field you're in. If you're a childbirth educator, if you're a doula, you're a home visitor, whatever, if you're not a trained mental health provider, there is a certain amount of limit that you have, but you can still be really incredibly important. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Kathleen Kendall-Tackett, and this is Science Check Report. Today, I'm going to try to answer some questions that I get a lot of times about, what can average practitioners do who might notice that there's a situation with new moms in the community. They might want to do something about postpartum depression, but they don't know how. And they always say, well, there's no money for that. It's really hard to get government money. Yeah, all of that's true. It is very hard. And it's something that can be a significant barrier. But I want to say, don't give up hope here, because having worked in the nonprofit segment forever, for my entire career, I can tell you that if you are creative, there are things that you can do that will make the situation better for new moms. Okay, so again, you really do have to keep in mind always your scope of practice. What is kind of allowable limits of your profession, whatever field you're in. If you're a childbirth educator, if you're a doula, you're a home visitor, whatever, if you're not a trained mental health provider, there is a certain amount of limit that you have, but you can still be really incredibly important. So what I want to encourage you to do is don't give up just because there's not a bunch of funding that's available, that, the funding fairy will suddenly land. It really is going to be frustrating for you. And I think it will limit the things that you can do. There's actually a lot you can do. So what I'd actually kind of like to draw your attention to, if you've never read the book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. The first one is, looking at the situation and asking yourself the question, what can I do? And oftentimes you may not be able to kind of address the problem quite the way you want, but maybe you could take a step in the direction. So that's what I'd like to kind of review is, what are some things that you can do as providers going through situations and coming up with situations and doing something that can be done reasonably in your community that still doesn't violate your scope of practice, but actually honestly could make a tremendous difference. Now, we talked in the previous 2 segments about kind of different screening measures. I think that's a really good first step. But I always encourage anybody who screens, I always encourage to say, okay, so what are you going to do next? And that's the part I want you to kind of think about now. So one of the things I'd like to say before you kind of do any of these other steps, before you even plan to do screening and stuff, is think about what other kind of resources you have in your community. Do you have access to, mental health providers, either in person or online? Are there services for domestic violence? Are there services for things like, food and housing? Are there doula services? I mean, there's just a number of things that could be available in the community that maybe you don't know about. Everybody kind of seems to operate in their own little vacuum. And so what I want to do is encourage you to think about, okay, so what kinds of things are there and how can I access them? And probably also get in contact with them and say, look, I'm thinking about starting to do something. Can I send mothers your way who need help? And I think oftentimes you're going to find that people are pretty enthusiastic because they've probably noticed the same thing, that there's a real want of services in your community. They want to do something about it. Or within a certain group of mothers, say you're working in a community that is in the minority and they don't really feel safe going to the regular established, sources of care. What kinds of things can you tell them and what kinds of things can be helpful? Okay, so let's talk about today. I'm going to start talking about some interventions that are pretty easy to do that mothers can do themselves, but I'm going to put some caveats on them. And in the next session, I'm going to talk about some other kind of community-based programs. So again, I'm going to try to give you some places to start with what kinds of things can be helpful and what can get mothers to go and take the next step. So if they need more assistance, what kinds of things can you do to help them? Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the alternative things that mothers can do. And this is stuff that they can take care of themselves. They don't necessarily need to access care. I would encourage them to probably, especially if symptoms are severe, to access care. But sometimes mothers are so terrified, and they're terrified, like if they say anything, their babies are going to get taken away. And unfortunately, that's not always unrealistic. That has happened. That's happened in my community. A few years ago, one summer, two different women went to see their primary carers and said that they were feeling depressed. Next thing you know, CPS came and took away their babies, which was total overreaction. And unfortunately, that sends a message to everybody else, everybody who hears about that kind of stuff. It just stops them from coming forward. So again, part of this is kind of establishing trust. It's establishing a relationship, but we also have to be careful to not exceed our scope of practice, whatever it is. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some alternative treatments and I'm going to kind of give you some pros and cons of them. And these are things mothers can do themselves. But one thing I would encourage you to do is, first of all, if mothers decide to try these rather than going and seeing a healthcare provider, I would encourage, you to tell them to take that screening scale in a month, in 6 weeks, in 2 months, see how they're doing. Are the symptoms getting better? Because, the problem is sometimes you can get stuck, you think you're doing something and you're not getting any better. So we don't want that. Second, for many of these things, I'm going to suggest that they talk to their healthcare providers because some of this stuff can interact. If they're taking other medications, some of this stuff can interact. So I want to make sure that they're kind of safe there. Okay, so let's jump in and talk about one of my favorite interventions, which I think honestly every mother should be on, and that is the long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. Okay, and particularly the omega-3 fatty acids. That's the ones we're really going to talk about. Okay, so the way that this kind of works is there's this category called essential fatty acids. Okay, and what that means is you have to take them. You have to take them for material your body can't manufacture them. Okay, but they're kind of important for healthy functioning, just in general. And they do actually have a lot to do with depression. Okay, so when you talk about fatty acids, the categories are kind of two big ones, the omega-6s and omega-3s. Okay, so omega-6s are your kind of pro-inflammatory fatty acids. Okay, now again, some of that is necessary. Okay, but the problem is with these, we have way too many of them in our diets because any vegetable oil, any processed food, anything is going to have these omega-6s in it. So chances are mothers that you're talking to already have way too many in our diet. And that's what's led a lot of researchers in this field to conclude that part of the problem we have and part of these massive health problems that we have is because we're consuming way too many of these pro-inflammatory omega-6s. Okay, so again, the long chain omega-6 that a lot of times people talk about is something called arachidonic acid. Okay, but the ones that we don't tend to get as much of are the omega-3s. Now, the omega-3s are really important because they're anti-inflammatory. And so, as I've talked about in other sessions, inflammation is a really important thing that actually contributes to a lot of disease. Okay, and we know that. And we know it contributes to heart disease and diabetes and metabolic syndrome and cancer and on and on. But it also is the underlying foundation of most mental health disorders. Okay, so high inflammation means more depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, even bipolar disorder. Okay, so that seems to be the underlying physiological mechanism. And so again, that's the thing that many of these treatments I want to talk about have in common is they actually are treatments that actually lower inflammation. They lower it in different ways, but they do all lower inflammation. Okay, so when we talk about the omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, the ones we're the most interested in are what they call the long chain. Okay, so that has to do with just their chemical makeup. So you start with the parent omega-3 fatty acid, which is alpha linoleic acid. Okay, and that is actually something you find in a lot of vegetable sources like walnuts, like flaxseed oil. But in terms of depression and things like that, it's not that helpful because it takes a while for those to become long chain fatty acids. And so what you take, only about 10% of it becomes a long chain fatty acid. So you'd have to consume pounds and pounds and pounds. So, when people say, oh yeah, just, add some flaxseed. Well, that's good for other things, but it's not good for this. Okay. We need something a little more concentrated. Okay. So kind of the next one on the chains, you start getting, into the longer chain is something called DHA. DHA is a fatty acid that actually some manufacturers have started adding to in formula. And we know for infants in utero development, it's very important to have DHA because it contributes to brain and vision development. But the problem is that we don't get a lot of DHA in our diets. If we don't eat fish, we don't tend to have a lot of that in our diets. And so that's one of the reasons why a lot of people recommend it as a prenatal supplement. Okay. And so it is very important for that. Okay. Now they actually recommend a dose of 200 milligrams. Okay. But much of this research looking specifically at depression, but also, birth outcomes and things like that, they're looking at population studies where they're looking at countries where people naturally eat a lot of fish. They eat between a pound and a pound and a half a week. And in those studies, the rates of postpartum depression is significantly lower. Okay. And so their hypothesis was that it is actually because they're getting so much of this anti-inflammatory polyunsaturated omega-3 in their system. Okay. And I actually think that there is a lot of credibility. Okay. So DHA is actually really important. And it is so critical for the baby's development that any stores that the mom has, and most Western mothers, it's pretty minimal, the baby will actually take from those stores. So it leaves the mothers even more depleted. So supplementing with those, I think, is very appropriate. Okay. But the recommended dose is 200 milligrams a day. Now, in those population studies where people eating a lot of fish, you find actually that mothers are getting on average between 800 and 1,000 milligrams a day of DHA. And I think that's actually closer to the amount that they need to get. Okay, so that's actually one of the things that I think is where we're kind of lowballing this a little bit. We probably need to be closer. Now, what's kind of interesting is DHA doesn't do too much in terms of depression, but we know it does have other important functions. It's more like, probably, when it comes to depression, more like a helper. It's not the primary agent. But I do think, especially for pregnant women, I think they should be taking that bigger dose. And especially if there's any risk at all, that they're going to be at risk for preterm babies. Because what they find is that mothers who are low in that tend to be much more likely to have preterm babies, and especially if they're under a lot of stress. Okay. And so you can actually see stress in certain groups who have experienced kind of cultural traumas, and they tend to have more preterm babies. Okay. But the omega-3s actually do counter that. And I remember during COVID talking to a group out in California, and they were saying, gosh, they were just having such a trouble, because COVID was so stressful for everybody. And all of a sudden, they're just having all these babies that are born premature. And I was kind of like, okay, I got a solution for you here. What you want to do is actually, get those mothers on some DHA. And I recommend it between 800 and 1,000. Okay, so that is actually based on a Cochrane review that was published in 2018 by Middleton et al. And they actually looked at all the evidence, and they concluded that it was so compelling, this evidence, that DHA actually can really increase gestational age and prevent preterm birth, that they actually said no further studies need to be done. And so it's kind of like, to me, this is a sort of no-brainer. First of all, it's good for the mothers. It's good for their overall health. Okay. And it's good for their long-term health, but it's also good for the baby's development. And it also can really decrease the odds that the mothers will actually have their babies prematurely, which is one of the number one causes of infant mortality worldwide. So it seems like it's a pretty simple, pretty inexpensive thing to do. So that's kind of one thing where I think the omega-3 fatty acids are good. Okay, but what about depression? You're probably asking, because we were started talking about that. Okay, so when we're talking about depression, the next one down in the chain, so the even longer chain, is one called EPA. So EPA is the one that seems to be the effective treatment for depression. DHA may help prevent it, but to actually treat mothers with depression, that seems to be the one that really does make the difference. Okay, and a few years ago, I found that actually the evidence was pretty compelling that these could be given as a mono treatment. Okay, but I think the studies lately have been a little more mixed in terms of, is this a treatment? And I would say it's probably at this point a good adjunct treatment. It's something that can help, but it's not going to be the sole thing. So that's actually kind of where we are with EPA. And so what we're looking at is probably taking about 1 gram of EPA a day. Okay, so you might think, okay, well, how do you get that? Well, when you're talking about perinatal women, so either during pregnancy or postpartum, we want to make sure that they're taking a supplement that doesn't have contaminations, because that's a problem. And that's a problem, honestly, with eating a lot of fish. And generally, when it comes to nutrition advice, I'd rather see people get that from food rather than, okay, we're just going to take this pill, we're going to have this fortified food, or we're going to do something. But there are times when taking the supplement is actually really, in my view, probably the safer option. The reason I think that is because if you take these supplements, there's two brands that are available in North America and also in different parts of the world. And that is, first of all, Nature Made. That's one of the brands. And the other is Kirkland Signature. Now, you can buy more expensive brands that also have the testing, but those are ones that are pretty accessible. And it's because an organization called the U.S. Pharmacopoeia actually does regularly testing on those two brands. Okay. And they actually have verified them. And so they test to make sure that what's on the label is actually in the supplement. They test to make sure that there's things like no contaminants, no heavy metals, no PCBs, anything like that, anything that's going to be harmful to either the fetus or for the infant through breast milk. Okay, so that's important. Some of these other more expensive brands, yeah, they're also tested, but they're quite a bit more expensive. So these are ones. So the Kirkland Signature brand is available at Costco, which is now kind of spreading all over the world. We were just with friends in Madrid. There was one there. There's one in Tokyo. So these are accessible in a lot of places. Not to mention, well, except for where I live in Amarillo, Texas, they're not available here. For some reason, we don't have a Costco. I don't think we have enough population. But anyway, those are two brands. Nature Made, I could certainly get, and you'll see the USP brand right on the label. Okay, so that's kind of important to look for. And so, I said some of the big evidence initially was looking at population studies, but they've also done ones where they have had people, say, for example, who were taking antidepressants. Okay, and the antidepressant wasn't really quite treating depression. And that honestly is not unusual. The newer, and I say newer in quotes, have been around for like 25 years, 30 years now. But the SSRI antidepressants, they were considered a big improvement over the previous, generation of them because their treatment rate was about 60 to 70%. Okay, so you want something that's greater than 30%, that's considered the placebo. Okay, so the treatment rate was higher, but that leaves 30 to 40% that are still actually not treated. And so again, a lot of times people give people antidepressants and they think, okay, yeah, we're done. You're done. We've got it all sorted out. But the thing is, that's actually not true necessarily. And so again, it's really important to kind of do follow-up testing stuff, which I find a lot of people don't do. They just send out people on their way with antidepressants. And the problem is they're still depressed. And now they're taking antidepressants, which have oftentimes pretty significant side effects. Okay, so what they've tried to do kind of out in the research world is they take some of these people who are not responding to antidepressants. And again, like I said, it's a pretty good segment. And they try adding omega-3s to their treatment. And again, part of that is because they're addressing the inflammation in depression. And that was something Michael Moss, who's been a pretty brilliant theorist on this, and he said, the problem with the kind of class of antidepressants that we've had, the SSRIs, the SNRIs, is he said they're made to actually change levels of monoamine neurotransmitters. So serotonin, norepinephrine, in some cases dopamine, they're made to change those levels. He says, but they don't deal with inflammation. Not really. They kind of do, but they don't have a strong anti-inflammatory effect. And he said, if you add some anti-inflammation treatment, he says, you're going to boost the effectiveness. And that's indeed what they found. Okay, there have been some kind of interesting prevention studies. This guy called Hibbelin, he did a lot of population studies. He looked at prisons and he found that if he gave prison population omega-3s in their food or in their water, in their drink, and found that there was much less fighting kind of post-treatment because it just kind of calmed things down. So there's a lot of really good things. There's good reasons to take these. There really is no downside. Now, the only thing that people have ever written about is they said, well, omega-3s could cause potential bleeding. So they didn't want you taking them before you, for example, had a cesarean section. So in the 2 or 3 weeks leading up to birth, they didn't want you taking them because they thought it could cause hemorrhage and bleeding. Honestly, there really actually hasn't been evidence to support that. It's more of a theoretical concern. And you see those sometimes. People will talk about, okay, this is what we think might happen. But in reality, it hasn't. And there was one place in particular where I think this is relevant to perinatal women. It was a population study in the Faroe Islands, Okay, so if you think about, you want to know where the Faroe Islands are. The Faroe Islands are kind of like Greenland, owned by Denmark. Okay, but if you go up past Scotland, past the Shetland, the Orkney Islands, the Shetland Islands, you kind of go halfway to Greenland. There's this little island called the Faroe Islands. Okay, so in the Faroe Islands, they eat a lot of fish. It's a whaling community. That's how they kind of have their livelihood. And so they eat a lot of fish. So what they've actually kind of found is, first of all, these babies, oftentimes there were some problems because they actually went post date. So again, it's more evidence for this idea that supports that, having a lot of fish oil prevents preterm birth. But these babies were also very healthy and large, and they actually, didn't really actually have any kind of problem with any kind of hemorrhage during these births. Sometimes it was challenging because the mothers were post dates, the babies were pretty big, but really, I mean, if there would have been a time when you see that, because the amount that they did was probably something like 10 times the recommended dose. Okay, so not only did it not cause any excessive bleeding, it seemed to actually be good for the baby's, gestational length and the baby's gestational age and even how healthy they were, but didn't seem to cause a lot of hemorrhaging. Okay, so how do you get 1 gram? Okay, so when you look at most supplements, okay, they're going to be kind of a mixture. They're going to have DHA in them. They're going to probably have some other kind of oil as a base, and then they'll have EPA. So what you need to do is, if you're going to try this, you're going to want to do fish oil, and you might want to break it up, have some in the morning, some at night. But you're going to need to look at your fish oil capsules and see, okay, how much to get that 1,000 milligrams. And so for some supplements, it's going to be anywhere from 4 to 6 a day, which is going to seem like a lot, but it's going to be one of those things that's going to help boost to mental health. And it may actually be something that can be very effective to be used with others. So I'd say check out those ones that are founded by, or tested by the US Pharmacopoeia. That is an organization, it's a non-governmental organization that grew up to sort of govern the nutraceutical industry. And what they did is companies can voluntarily submit their products, and it's an ongoing process. They have to keep doing it. So it's not just one and done. But then they measure like everything that's in it, that the label matches up. So they try to really kind of make sure that the consumers are getting what they paid for and that it is free of contaminants. So look for that USP seal. You can actually look on their site. They may have some other ones that, are listed that are appropriate for your area. And I would say, yeah, that's something you could do. Now, I have actually a paper on my website, KathleenKendall-Tackett.com, called Can Fats Make You Happy? It goes into some details about this. And I'm going to actually suggest you might want to take also a look at that. It's got some of the references. We don't have a ton of newer references on it just because people have kind of moved on. It was a hot area for a while, but I think especially since that Cochrane review, people kind of have stopped. It hasn't had as much. But what it seems to do is think about this as part of a treatment. I wouldn't do this as solely a treatment, but this is definitely going to help. Okay, so with that, I'm going to actually stop and we're going to move on to the next section and talk about some other things that mothers can do and take. So until I see you next time, I wish you good luck and take a look into that. And I will actually recommend, I'll put a link for that article on the website. Okay, until next time, bye.